Right, good afternoon. Now, we've all been talking about the Zimbabwean crisis, and a lot of people have been trying to understand what is the reason for the crisis that we've got in Zimbabwe at this particular time. There are many theories that are being given. The other day I was watching 702 and a Zimbabwean gentleman by the surname of Mwandiambira was speaking to Aubrey Masango. And here he was explaining what he thinks the problem in Zimbabwe is. And as he was explaining this problem that he thinks is in Zimbabwe, he began to epitomize the problem that we actually have in Zimbabwe. The problem that we've got in Zimbabwe is one that is being caused by Zimbabweans themselves. The problem that we've got in Zimbabwe is one that is caused by Zimbabweans living in denial. And another problem that we've got in Zimbabwe is the fact that Zimbabweans do not understand their obligations as citizens for their own nation. So I'm making this video for non-Zimbabweans because I've made so many videos like this for Zimbabweans, but they do not listen. So now I'm making this for those of you that might find yourself in the situation of Zimbabwe and those Africans that actually want to decolonize their nations rather than the situation we've got with Zimbabweans that are in love with colonialism. Zimbabwe is the only country on earth that is under US sanctions but pretends like it's not under sanctions. Zimbabwe is the only country on earth that is under US sanctions, but it always likes to act like US sanctions have got no impact on Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is the only country on earth that has got the same sanctions that were on Iraq, the same sanctions that were on Libya, the same sanctions that brought down Libya and Iraq, but they pretend like there are no sanctions in this country called Zimbabwe. That is one of the biggest problems that is in Zimbabwe that is causing the problems that you see in Zimbabwe. And while Zimbabwe is under these sanctions, that we call war and defense sanctions, according to the definitions given by the Americans, Zimbabweans continue to say they are not under sanctions. Now you need to understand the absurdity of this. Zimbabwe is under the same sanctions that are on South Korea, Venezuela, Iran, and all these other countries acknowledge the sanctions that are on their countries, and they acknowledge the impact that these sanctions have on their countries, but Zimbabweans in their pride continue to say that sanctions are not the problem in Zimbabwe. Zimbabweans will tell you that corruption is the problem in Zimbabwe, but yet nations like Nigeria that have a lot more corruption, nations like India, and even South Africa, they don't have the same problems that Zimbabwe has. The only thing that Zimbabwe has that they don't have is sanctions, but the Zimbabwean continues to say sanctions are not the problem in Zimbabwe. This is the problem we have in Zimbabwe. Zimbabweans themselves are idiots. Zimbabweans themselves are ignorant. Zimbabweans themselves are these fools that think a small little country like Zimbabwe can resist the sanctions that destroyed Libya and Iraq. This is the biggest problem you have in Zimbabwe, is that there's denialism of sanctions that are upon Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe doesn't have one set of sanctions like Iran or South Korea. Zimbabwe has got two sets of sanctions. Zidera sanctions that stop Zimbabwe from getting loans from the multilateral lending institutions, the IMF, World Bank, International Bank of Reconstruction and Development. Then Zimbabwe has got what are called executive order sanctions. The executive order sanctions are instituted by the National Emergency Act of America and also instituted by the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which are basically acts of war. One is a warfare that is economic, the other is a warfare that includes military. But Zimbabweans continue to say sanctions have no impact on Zimbabwe. And you will see that even other African countries have gone with the narrative that Zimbabweans have. Even other African countries have accepted the denialism of Zimbabwe because they benefit from Zimbabwe's denial. South Africa benefits when Zimbabwe denies sanctions because then it can simply say the Zimbabwean government is incompetent, Robert Mugabe was incompetent, and that's why Zimbabweans are coming to South Africa, because South Africa is managed by a smarter people who did not destroy their country like Mugabe did. But yet the issue is Zimbabwe has been at war with the United States under these sanctions, and these sanctions are not only imposed by the United States, but the United States, the Europeans, Canadians, and Australians are united in this isolation of Zimbabwe, destruction of Zimbabwe, so that this country cannot decolonize, and so that an example is made of Zimbabwe for taking its land to stop South Africa from taking land. But as Africans, we are so stupid that we will let another country be isolated by united European countries, all so that we can take the benefits from this isolated country. South Africa has taken the benefit on Zimbabwean sanctions by taking all the people, the colonizers, the Rhodesians, the Europeans that had money in Zimbabwe, those who externalized their monies illegally, those that stole in Zimbabwe, those that stole the resources, those that used slave labor in Zimbabwe. The South African government allowed those people to illegally transfer their money into the South African economy, and then they gave those very same people who had stolen from Zimbabwe citizenship so that they can come and live in South Africa. In South Africa. They were part and parcel of this sabotage that was started by these Western powers. They were part and parcel of accepting what we call money laundering of illegal finances from Zimbabwe into South Africa. That's why South Africa will not accept that Zimbabwe is under sanctions, because they have been complicit in taking stolen funds. But ask yourself, if you stole funds today from the United Kingdom and try to transfer them to South Africa, would the South African government and banking system accept? Would the South African Financial Intelligence Center accept you to transfer illegal funds that you have stolen from the United Kingdom? Or let's even call it illegal funds that you are repatriating, money that was stolen by the British. If you brought it back to South Africa, would the South African government accept that? No, they wouldn't. But they were able to accept funds to be stolen and illegally transferred from Zimbabwe into South Africa for them to have economic benefit from stolen proceeds from Zimbabwe when sanctions and warfare was imposed on Zimbabwe. Now we have got problems in Zimbabwe. The problems of overconsumption without producing enough. We've got problems of corruption in Zimbabwe. But the problem in Zimbabwe is not that. These things have an impact on Zimbabwe, just like corruption has an impact on South Africa, overconsumption has an impact on South Africa, overconsumption has an impact on most of Africa, but the impact that is on Zimbabwe is one that is caused by something much more than that, which is the sanctions that are on Zimbabwe. Why do I say this? Right now, you've got Ethiopia being said the best performing country in Africa, the fastest growing economy in Africa. Zimbabwe exports and generates more foreign currency, 3 times more foreign currency than Ethiopia does. They say Rwanda is performing amazingly, but Zimbabwe exports more and creates more foreign currency than Rwanda and Ethiopia put together. So that means that the Zimbabwean economy, even though it's under sanction, still outproduces the Ethiopian and Rwandese economies. Zimbabwe exports more just in tobacco than what it is that Rwanda exports and what it is that Ethiopia exports. Just in tobacco. This is before we start talking about gold. This is before we start talking about repatriations of professionals that are Zimbabweans that are outside Zimbabwe, who bring in close to $3 billion into the Zimbabwean economy. But while that may be, Zimbabwe still doesn't have a currency. While that may be, Zimbabwe still does not have fuel. And the question is why? Now, if you understand the sanctions that are on Zimbabwe, they are economic, but you've also got military sanctions that are on Zimbabwe that were put in by the National Emergency Act of the United States. These actually allow the American government to put troops on Zimbabwean soil, because war was imposed on Zimbabwe in 2003 when the government of Zimbabwe, of the United States of America, or George Bush, declared Zimbabwe an unusual and extraordinary threat against national security and economic interests of the United States government. But you need to understand that warfare doesn't only take place when soldiers are on your soil. The economic hitman told us that warfare can take place with spies being put in your country. Warfare can take place with spies of your own nation being turned against the nation and working against your nation. Warfare can take place with sabotage. And in Zimbabwe, we have had cholera outbreaks. The last time we had cholera outbreaks in Zimbabwe was during the Rhodesian War. During the Rhodesian War, the Rhodesian soldiers, in cahoots with the British and American mercenaries and the American and British governments that they were working with, put cholera into our water systems to stop our liberation fighters from fighting against Rhodesia. They also put anthrax, and the greatest anthrax outbreak in the world happened in Rhodesia while our parents were being killed off by anthrax spores that had been put into our water systems by the Rhodesians. That level of sabotage is happening with the cholera outbreaks that we also see in Zimbabwe today. And those levels of sabotage have continued. Warfare can be sabotage. Warfare can be espionage. There are many ways. And in Zimbabwe, it's one country where we've got our opposition members who say that they want Zimbabwe to progress, but they support the economic sanctions in Zimbabwe. When they support these economic sanctions, they ask for the United States to maintain these war and defense economic sanctions on Zimbabwe so that Zimbabwe can be brought to its knees. And when Zimbabwe is brought to these knees, these very same people are the ones that send people onto the street to protest in an attempt to overthrow the government of Zimbabwe. This has happened before in countries where the CIA has financed groups of people. In Iran, during the Shah, in Libya, in Iraq, to overthrow governments so that they can put in opposition party puppets into power. We are seeing the very same things that happened in Iraq, the same things that happened in Libya, and those that happened during the Arab Spring happening in Zimbabwe. Do not be lied to. Zimbabweans are not broke. There's no fuel in the service stations, not because Zimbabweans can't afford to buy fuel. Somebody is buying up the fuel. Somebody is buying up everything from the grocery stores. Somebody with big capital is taking goods out of the market in a country where people actually have money to buy the goods. Zimbabweans have got US dollars to import cars. They're building houses on record levels, cash, not debt. Zimbabweans do not take any debt to build their homes. They don't take debt to buy cars. So Zimbabweans have got money, but there's no products in the service stations, no products in the shops. And people are saying we've imported 45% more fuel this year than we did last year. So where is the fuel going? There are cartels that are operating in Zimbabwe, part and parcel of the sabotage that we're talking about. But the Zimbabwean is the only one that cannot see the mechanisms that were used in Libya, the mechanisms that were used in Iraq, operating in Zimbabwe right now. Now I'm saying to you, here in South Africa, you guys want to take land without compensation. The sanctions around Zimbabwe are actually an example to you. They are being instituted on Zimbabwe as a warning to South Africa that if you try to take land without compensation, if you try to radically transform the economy, what is happening to Zimbabwe will happen to you. And to prove to you that what I'm right is true, what do you think the American soldiers in Botswana are there for? They are there to bring in the National Emergency Act fulfillment by military action if need be. The same thing that happened to Libya when AFRICOM surrounded Libya with armies and their troops to eventually go into Libya and take off Muammar Gaddafi. Zimbabwe is at the brink of something similar, but Zimbabweans don't know that. Our opposition parties, our social and civil groups understand that they are being paid by somebody to cause the unrest that is caused by the sanctions that they keep calling for. It's time that you start understanding what's happening. Neocolonialism 2.0. Neocolonialism 2.0 is taking place in Africa, and African leaders are quiet, silent, and they are sabotaging each other in the process. Never forget that it is South Africa that signed the UN resolution that put a no-fly zone over Libya that saw Muammar Gaddafi removed. That is why the ANC government does not speak of the sanctions that are on Zimbabwe, because they are complicit with those very same sanctions, because this country of South Africa is under the control of white monopoly capital that tells the ANC government what to do. Julius Malema understands this well. This is why today he is beginning to talk about African unity, because he knows that if South Africa is to try and take land and other African countries isolate South Africa the way that Zimbabwe was isolated, South Africa would collapse in less than 3 months. Because this country doesn't own its seeds, it doesn't own its banks, it doesn't own its houses, doesn't own its land. Basically, white monopoly capital will be able to collapse this economy, what they could not do to Zimbabwe. It's time that we understand this. And it's time somebody spoke this truth, that Zimbabweans are in the position that they are in because they are under a warfare through the United States government and her European and Western allies, but Zimbabwe is pretending like nothing is going on. Yet it's got the same sanctions that were on Libya and Iraq, the same sanctions that brought down Libya and Iraq. That's why Zimbabwe is struggling. That's why Zimbabwe's got all the problems that it has. Don't let anybody tell you that it's an issue of corruption. Which country doesn't have corruption? America itself has got corruption, and corruption makes Americans rich. But Zimbabwe is under these sanctions, this warfare, and it's being isolated by other African countries that benefit from Zimbabwe's demise.